afternoon. I'm Sean Gibbons from the Communications Network. Thank you for being with us. You are hopefully here for the right thing. A webinar entitled The Science of Story Building. You're going to be joined today by Ann Cristiano, Annie Niemand, and Matt Sheehan, who are all at the College of Journalism and Communications down in Gainesville, Florida, at the University of Florida. The good news, for those of you who were with us in Miami Beach at ComNet 17 and had the great good fortune to sit in and hear from Ann and Annie a little bit about this, we're going to give you a little bit more elbow room. When we were in Miami, a number of you told us that the room was overfilled, and I had the chance to put my head in, and that's entirely true. Because they have a lot of really extraordinary things to share. And over the next hour, we're going to hear them. Hopefully you get yourself comfortable. You have a little bit more space this time out. If you didn't have a chance to hear from them, I can assure you you're in for a really extraordinary treat. Over the next hour, we're going to talk about how to use the best of what we know from science to construct stories that are compelling, persuasive, and memorable. How to construct narratives that create space for audiences to see their own values reflected in the work, and where to find new insights that can inform effective story building. That sounds pretty good to me. Hopefully this does for you as well. A few quick logistical items before we get underway. As you all might expect, this is an awfully popular topic. Storytelling is very much on the minds of many of us. We have a very full house, over 550 folks signed up to join us, so we're going to try to take everybody's questions. And if you are not familiar with us, you can put in your questions just by going into the lower left-hand corner of the webinar tech. There's a place where it says feedback. You can type your message in there. I'd encourage you to do so early. We'll have a couple of plots along the way, or a couple of places along the way where we'll stop and take your questions. You can also ask us questions on Twitter. So if you're online and you're on the Twitter platform and you use the hashtag ComNetLive, that's ComNetLive. You can send in a question. Many of you live tweet. We always appreciate and love to see that. The key takeaways and those sorts of things. We will be taking your questions throughout the presentation, so you can put them in the webinar technology or up on Twitter, and we'll get to those. And as always, as we always do, this webinar will be recorded, and we'll post it up on comnetwork.org for free replays, probably within the next week or so. So again, thanks to Matt, to Annie, and to Ann for joining us. And Ann, I think you're going to kick us off. So why don't you take it away?
Terrific. Thanks so much, Sean, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. We're so excited to have the opportunity to share this with you again. We're really grateful to ComNet for providing us with this platform and this opportunity to share content that we're really excited about. We're also grateful to the Knight Foundation, who supported this work and supported our initial exploration and inviting story scientists in from around the world to find out what they thought. I also want to acknowledge Andy Goodman's just extraordinary leadership in this area. Our field owes so much to him in really encouraging us to tell stories that are extraordinary and inspiring and change how people think. And I am certain that we wouldn't be having this conversation were it not for Andy and his tremendous leadership. We're going to be tweeting out examples of some of the different points that we're making on this call. An hour is great, but it just never seems like enough. So the things that we can't get to are examples that we think illustrate these points. We're going to be tweeting out using the ComNet hashtag and also using the hashtag StoryScience. Those will be coming from the Frank Gathering Twitter feed. So if you're following that on Twitter, you'll be able to see those right away. And I think ComNet's going to retweet those as well. So without further ado, let me turn over to my colleague Matt Sheehan, who's going to set us up today.
Great. Thank you, Ann. As Ann mentioned, we're very excited to be here. Ann is the Frank Carell Chair in Public Interest Communication and a member of the Public Relations faculty. I have the pleasure of being her colleague in the Journalism Department, where I work in emerging platforms and kind of new ways of telling stories. And we're also joined today by our colleague Annie Niemand, who's a doctoral candidate in sociology, but also wears many hats here at the college, including the research director for our Frank efforts, as well as the communication director for our college. So a lot of what we're talking about today, we try to employ in practice as well. This is going to be a very quick overview session. There's a lot of fascinating work that's going on within these fields that an hour, as Ann mentioned, just really isn't enough time to dive deeply in it. So we're going to give you a little overview of some of the areas of research that fascinate us. And of course, we'll remain as a resource for you all as you're developing your stories, and please feel free to reach out to us. Our Twitter handles are on the screen as you see, and then our contact information, more direct contact information, we'll share with you at the end. So to start, we want to start with you. And we want you to think of a story that you're telling as part of your work. And just jot it down real quick on a piece of scratch paper in front of you. You're not going to have to share your work, although we'd love to hear it. You're not submitting it for exams or anything like that. But it's a good opportunity for you guys to just take a sketch at something that we'll be coming back to throughout the presentation. So let's take a minute or two right now for you to write down your story.
I see the ashes of the masters who touch the masses. I ask if I'll ever be one. When I die, will heaven be done? What will my legend become? I will forever be young. These old tales of breakdancing down at Odell's. Streets named after me is where my soul dwells. Desires of the church choir, Trinity united. I think of good memories that Hennessy provided. Memories divided by perception. Will it be water for chocolate or resurrection? The path to perfection is rarely achieved. I head in a direction I dream and believe. An underground dude that overachieved. From the windy city I was blowing a weed. Somewhere along the way I aired out and see. But to stand out some days you may dream. Degrees. Who lives? Who dies? Who holds on? Who alive? Time and time again. They tell your story in the end. Yo.
Okay, well I hope everybody had an opportunity to jot down at least one story that they tell as part of their experience. And congratulations, by that very effort of telling that story and by telling stories proves that humans, among all other animals, are at the top of the food chain. If you've come across the book Sapiens or its successor, you may be familiar with this thesis that humans are the only creatures that tell stories as a way of sharing facts. So often we believe that just sharing information is what actually creates our society. But time and time again, we've seen in the animal kingdom, lots of animals share facts. Humans are the only ones that share stories. So we have been fascinated by this, and of course, paying homage again to Andy, we wanted to know more about what makes stories work. Storytelling is an art, but there's got to be some science that can inform that art. Last year, we gathered nearly 20 scholars from a range of disciplines, including psychology, sociology, horror, beyond the communication fields, to try to start answering this question that was posited by Jerome Bruner, one of the leading psychologists who's no longer with us. But we know a lot about science and logical reasoning. We don't know a lot, in any formal sense, about how to make good stories. And that's really what we wanted to dive into. Over this year-long effort, we've pared that down, this fascinating science, to 7 principles that we're going to share with you today, centered around how we tell stories and how we choose stories. The first principle we wanted to talk about was structure. And we've seen time and time again throughout research that narrative and narrative construction of imparting information is one of the best ways to share information with a wide audience of non-experts or people with different levels of expertise in the topic that you're looking at. So the structure of the story must adhere, or is best to adhere, to that narrative style. And we've all seen this before. All narrative stories and all good stories have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and follow this basic story arc where you have an exposition that leads to a rising action, to a climax, to a falling action, to a resolution. This is not new. This is not rocket science. science. This is not breaking news. We went through this in high school, in middle school, in elementary school storytelling. This is a tool. So often, though, as communicators, we forget about telling stories, and we tell vignettes instead. So many of our stories don't have that beginning, that middle, and the end. We mostly, often, will fall just in the middle. In addition to following our findings showing us that following that story arc is a great principle in narrative storytelling, we also see through the work of Christopher Booker, among others, that there are essentially 7 basic plots that most narrative stories follow. And those plots you may be familiar with: overcoming the monster, the rags to riches story, the quest, stories of voyage and return, where the characters leave their comfortable world, go to a new world, and come back transformed. Stories that follow the Greek archetype of comedy, and not just necessarily using humor, but that the characters are transformed through good events, not just sad events. And of course, it's twin and partner tragedy, and stories of rebirth. These are the 7 basic plots, which all stories often follow. So as you are going through and developing your stories, can you identify which of the 7 plots did your story use? And can you perhaps take the facts that you have and reframe it to fit another universal plot that could potentially make it a little bit more interesting? Now, throughout this, we will love to take your questions. Anytime you see a white screen with a prompt like this is your opportunity to send us questions. We're monitoring through the assistance of Tristan and Sean, and we'd love to answer any questions that you have going here. We also have some FAQs that we'd like to present. And Annie, what is one of the most common questions we get around structure?
One of the most common questions that we get is, does a story always have to have a problem?
Well, I think we've seen throughout, and Anne, please contribute to this, we've seen throughout that while we adhere to the 7 basic plots, not all of those plots necessarily has a problem. And it really depends on how you define the problem.
Yeah. And Matt, I see that somebody's asked if we can go back to the slide with the 7 story plots.
Of course.
You can click back. There you go. Terrific.
And we'll be happy to share these as well. Christopher Booker, I believe Annie was tweeting out, has just tweeted out on the hashtag StoryScience and ComNet Live a link to Booker's seminal work. It is a hefty volume, we will confess, but it is worth a gander.
All right. Sean, any questions you want to hit before we move on?
Not yet. I think, why don't we keep going forward? Well, actually, you know what? Let's go to McKinley's question here. If we can just scroll back up very, very briefly. What if it seems like my story doesn't fit any of the archetypes?
Well, I would personally, I would ask you to take a deeper look at your story. You know, we often use these 7 basic plots and think of them only through fictional work. But a lot of the non-fictional stories that we see adhere to that. Think politics. You know, there's a lot of these plot archetypes in the storylines that we see in political journalism. Very often there's the rags to riches story. The candidate brings themselves up by their bootstraps. Depending on what election year and what partisan swing you have, there's always an overcoming the monster story. So I think there are opportunities to kind of expand what we traditionally think of fairy tales or fictional work of these plots into our non-fictional storytelling.
I would also say that the reason that understanding these 7 plots and really, as Matt says, looking deeper at which of the 7 plots you're using is valuable is that we actually do tend to use the same plots over and over again. We do a lot of work on refugee issues, and one of the things that we find is that organizations working on behalf of refugees use the riches to rags plot structure pretty reliably, even though they sometimes feel like they're telling different kinds of stories. And that when you start to use different plots, for example, rebirth, you can tell a different kind of story that may be far more inspiring and may change how people see some of those issues. And so I'm going to go ahead on to the second one, which is to use emotion with intention. And, you know, one of the things that I think as I think back on my own days working for the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, when we decided that we were going to use emotion in a story, we kind of went here. We kind of went to the very sad story that moved people. And, you know, as I watch this, you're probably all wishing that I would click to the next slide and wishing that this would not be on anymore. And I'm not here to hear your suffering, so because the line is closed, but I'll click past it because look at this. Look at all of these different emotions that we have to work with. It's extraordinary to see how big that palette is and what might happen if we started to explore using some of those different emotions. We also know that using deep emotions as part of stories can create an emotional hangover, that when we feel something very strongly, either joy or grief or pain, we not only remember that incident, we remember everything that happened after that much more clearly. And so what's happening is that when you get your audience to feel something very profoundly and very deeply, they're also likely to remember the rest of the things that you say immediately after that. The field of adaptive psychology is controversial, but it's really interesting to think about emotions from an adaptive perspective. If you think about fear as an adaptive response that allowed us to project danger to the rest of our tribe very quickly and efficiently, or sadness, which causes us to reach out to one another. It's interesting, though, that many times people really want to avoid feeling these unpleasant emotions. People sometimes refer to them as negative. I think it's more helpful to refer to them as unpleasant emotions. And what can be really interesting is if you begin to experiment with more positive emotions in your storytelling, emotions like joy or awe can open people up to new experiences. And there's lots of research to suggest that awe in particular is associated with learning and acquiring new ideas and new insights. So those positive and unlikely emotions can be really powerful and can get people to pay attention to stories that they might otherwise turn away from. So what we want you to think about right now is to connect the emotions that you're evoking or invoking to what you're trying to get your audience to do. If you want your audience to reach out to others, then maybe sadness is the right direction to go, but know that that's risky because they might tune out. If you want your audience to think about something new or acquire a new perspective, maybe joy or pride or some of the more positive emotions might be more helpful. So think about what it is that you're trying to get your audiences to do as a result of having heard your story, and then think about what they would feel if they were doing that. And you might find that that brings you to invoking some new emotions as part of your storytelling.
One of the comments or questions that we get asked a lot is, should we not make people feel sad? Should we avoid sadness or fear in terms of emotions that we employ in our stories?
I think if you're going to tell a sad story, you also have to give people a resolution to that sadness, because we are living in a moment where I think people are feeling overwhelmed by the news and the information that's coming at them. And so if you have a resolution for that sadness, if you have something specific that you want them to do that's going to help give them a meaningful way to help solve that problem, then sadness can work.
So, Anne, one of the questions that has come through from Nathan is there any data to support the claims being made about how these emotions influence audience behavior? And Annie, you've done some research in this area.
Yeah, there's different researchers explore different emotions. There's research that shows that when you can incite awe in your audience, they're more likely to be open-minded and engage in self-reflection. So if you're presenting ideas through a story that potentially challenge how they see the world or may trigger things that would otherwise close off your audience, using awe is a really great strategic choice in that case because you're putting them in a state where they're more likely to be open-minded. We've also seen that humor plays a similar role. Humor is a useful way for talking about things that are really difficult to talk about or that are really polarizing and are really effective in bringing people together. So it's just a matter of the specific emotion. Researchers tend to focus on a particular type of emotion, pride. There's researchers working on that, humor, fear, and what you're trying to accomplish, and see which emotions could help you achieve your goals.
All right, so let's go on to the third principle, which is creating room for your audience. Now, people who have participated in creative writing programs or taken 10th grade writing have heard that they should be richly detailed in their writing. And it is true that details can be incredibly evocative, but it's also true that we need to let our audiences do some of the work. This is really about, instead of giving your audience the answer of 4, giving them 2 plus 2 and letting them work it out. Giving them the pieces of the story rather than giving them the solution up front. This is called the causal bridging inference for those of you who are theory nerds. And basically what that's saying is that stories that are more satisfying are stories that allow people 2 things, both the opportunity to understand and assemble some of the details for themselves, and second, the time to reflect on that and understand. So what that, let me give an example of that actually comes from a filmmaker early in the last century who wanted to demonstrate this fact that we bring our own understanding of what's going on in a story based on our own experience. This is famously called the Kuleshov effect, and Kuleshov was a filmmaker who created this short clip that I'm showing you now to demonstrate this effect. You see the soup, you see the man's face, you assume he's hungry. In the next clip, you see him looking at a child in a casket. You see his face and you see grief. You look at him looking at a beautiful woman lying on a couch, and you look at his face and you see desire. But what's interesting about this as you look back through is that you're seeing the exact same clip of his face in each of these shots. The only thing that's changing is what he's reacting to. And this is a film technique that's still used in films as a way of allowing us to project what we think he should be feeling on his face. We are doing part of the work, not allowing the filmmaker to do all of the work. We're not seeing him cry. We're not seeing him reach out to the woman. We're seeing the exact same footage and projecting what we think is happening. So as we think about this from Andrew Stanton, a famous, wonderful storyteller's perspective, he talks about this as the well-organized absence of information that draws us in. And so it's a great story is as much about what you leave out as what you put in. So the second part of leaving room for your audience is really creating room for the audience to connect the story to their own experience. And I have an example of this that you may have experienced, you may have seen yourself, particularly if you're really interested in South Korean politics. This piece quickly went viral. This expert on South Korean politics was doing an interview with BBC when his children came strolling into the room. And it was this moment of profound humanity. Robert Kelly was significantly criticized for this, but I think we can see it as an incredibly human moment. And all of us might wonder what we might do in similar circumstances. certainly far more people saw his news clip because of the intrusion of his family than would have if they were simply interested in South Korean politics. But I loved this comment that he made following the interview. He said, "My real life punched through the fake cover I had created on television." And his real life punching through is the thing that we all connected with. We also saw this in the tragedy of Elon Kurdi's death. And when Elon Kurdi's tiny body washed ashore, we saw in him a child who was deeply familiar to us. And when you look at how he's dressed as any child we know might be, with his little sneakers and his blue shoes and his red shirt. And his face is hidden from us, which makes it really easy for us we have just enough detail to imagine a child we love in the same position. And it is interesting that, of course, searches on his name spiked at the same time searches on the Syrian crisis spiked, and also donations to relief organizations spiked at the same time. So you saw this real confluence of a compelling story in which people could easily see their own experience connected to a specific action that people wanted to resolve. So if you look at, here are the charts of Google searches on the Syrian civil war and Elon Kurdi at that time, and you can see how these two things connected. So as you think about your stories, think about whether there's space in your stories for the audience to insert their own experience, and whether you're making your audience do some of the work.
And one question that we get a lot is, how do you make strategic decisions about what information you leave out and what information you leave in? What would you suggest?
I think it's really important to think about what the context of existing stereotypes and biases might be, because one of the studies that you and I were talking about the other day, Annie, showed that people left to fill in the details that are missing are going to what they already know. So we're going to fill in something that's familiar to us. Now, if you're trying to overcome a particular negative stereotype and you leave out the details and the context that would make it possible to do that, then people are going to go to their existing stereotypes. So that's a real area to be super thoughtful about what you're including and what you're not including. And what we really want you to take away from this is the incredible importance of being thoughtful about what you keep in your story and leave out. So, and Annie's got a link that she's going to tweet out on that study.
So one of the emerging areas of research that is really fascinating us right now is the fact that your story's verisimilitude is critical in being effective communicators. And right about now, when we do this in person, we see this flurry of phones being picked up or laptops being opened and Google approached. So we'll save you some work. Verisimilitude, in our definition, is the appearance of being true or real. So often as we're talking about storytelling, we may use a different word for that, and that word is authenticity. And we're always striving for authentic stories and telling those authentic stories. As we're seeing now, writ large in real life, that authenticity doesn't just depend on base facts. And this is a great area of research that a lot of folks are spending some time on, and we'll probably see a lot more formal research of that over the next few years. But we have to realize that in the environment that we're telling our stories, that confidence in institutions is declining. You see this graph from the Pew Center earlier, that military is probably the best. Even the scientific community is not as trusted as it once was. Doctors, education, and the press have seen declines as well. We're seeing this in terms of partisanship, in trust of national media. Now, we see these large differentials here. It could be the other way, too, depending on the party in power. So we can't just say it's because of what's going on now. But we also have excuse me, science and research that shows us it's not just the sources and the facts that we depend on to tell us whether a story is believable or not. We have more research here from the Pew Center earlier this year that shows that the sources that are used, the news organization that it comes from, and who's sharing it are critical to how we perceive that information. But the one that always we may not necessarily remember is that your gut instinct plays a large role in how you perceive that story. There's a lot of research coming out of Yale and the Cultural Cognition Project that centers around this, and Annie can tweet some of that out as we go along as well. Because folks, as much as we'd love to believe that we're all in one reality, we're not. Kurt Anderson, who many of you may know from Studio 360 or as the editor of Spy Magazine, has published a book called Fantasyland and has done some work, particularly this piece in The Atlantic in the September issue, that included this quote that I always take to heart as we're talking about the verisimilitude of stories, is that we expect a rational reaction to the information that we present, whereas it may not necessarily be taken that way. We are attracted to information that affirms our worldviews, and that we will turn away from information that runs counter to our sociological and cultural and family identities. And it's much more about us and our reaction than it is about the facts. So, as you're telling your stories and you're identifying the audiences that you are tying into, which details can you include or not include that may convince your audience of the verisimilitude or their truth of your story? We see there's a piece on NPR earlier this week about how scientists in their applications to federal funding are no longer using the word climate, but using different words to try to accomplish that same goal.
Matt, one question that we've received is there one form of authenticity? Is there one size fits all?
No. You know, there's been a lot of work and a lot of discussion about how there's no mass media anymore or mass audience, and I know our friends at Spitfire have done a lot of work in that in their methodologies as well, that you have to micro-target. And unfortunately, right now, because of our fractured and splintered consumption, we're all creating our own realities, depending on who your affinity groups are. And as researchers and as scholars and as scientists and as communicators, we need to figure out how and if we can come to one common reality again.
And one of the other questions that I see in the queue is this question, and Annie, you and I have gotten this before. Somebody is asking, at ComNet, one of the speakers suggested that people stop telling stories of individuals and start telling stories of systems, because stories of individuals can reinforce the personal responsibility frame. But as the person asking the question, I can't see his or her name, it says it's very difficult to tell a system story that has the same kind of power. And you and I talk about this all the time because we're pretty obsessed with systems thinking.
There's a fantastic couple of studies from Karen Ball Jorgensen, and we just tweeted out her name so you can look through her scholar publications. And she's looked at Pulitzer Prize winning stories over a 20-year period. And what she found that is common among all of these stories is that they're stories about big, complex, systems-level issues, but they're told through the stories of individuals. They're told through the lives of people affected by the issues. And what she says is that that is so critical for grounding systems-level issues in reality. And readers and viewers cannot connect and truly, on an emotional level, understand all of the systems at play if they do not experience them through the lives of the characters. And so I would argue that you can tell compelling stories of individuals whose experiences exemplify the systems and help you have a deep deeper emotional connection to those systems. There's a really great documentary, Paycheck to Paycheck, that came from the Maria Shriver people. They put out a report that goes with it that has lots of data on systems inequality. But the documentary does a really great job of telling the story of one woman trying to support her family and take care of her health. And after viewing it, you have a richer, deeper understanding of systemic inequality, of issues facing women's lives, of family issues that you couldn't get looking at just data, that you couldn't get looking at a sociological paper. So I would argue that you should tell stories about individuals, but make sure that you're rooting it in the data and that you're bringing that data in to color the context around them.
Great. Thanks. Great question, great answer. So the fifth principle is to surprise your audience. One of the things that I think has happened as many of us have adopted storytelling as a best practice is that a lot of the stories tend to get pretty formulaic and don't include the surprises that really capture our attention. One of the scientists who participated in our story building summit coaches the horror film industry on how to make movies scarier, which seems like a pretty cool gig to me. And one of the things that he told us is that people really want to have their stories be at just the edge of their expectation and just beyond the edge of their expectation so that keeps them listening. And we want you to look for stories that operate, that don't have predictable endings, that may take somebody down a road that they don't necessarily expect to go down. So we've looked for ways to illustrate this point, and one of the best examples I discovered came actually from one of my favorite TED Talks of all time. I hope that this is a talk that's familiar to you. It's Benjamin Zander talking about classical music and what makes us better people. And if you've got 17 minutes one day, you should for sure watch the whole talk. But I want to play one particular clip for you, which I think does a fantastic job of demonstrating why it's so important to live just at the edge of these expectations.
So let's see what's really going on here. We have a B. This is a B. The next note is a C. And the job of the C is to make the B sad. And it does, doesn't it? Composers know that. If they want sad music, they just play those two notes. But basically, it's just a B with four sads. Now it goes down to A, and now to G, and then to F. So we have B, A, G, F. And if we have B, A, G, F, what do we expect next? Oh, that might have been a fluke. Let's try it again. Ooh, the TED choir. And you notice nobody is tone deaf. Is that right? Nobody is. You know, every village in Bangladesh and every hamlet in China, everybody knows. Da, 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 da. Everybody knows who's expecting that E. Now, Chopin didn't want to reach the E there because what will have happened? It'll be over, like Hamlet. You remember Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 3, he finds out that his uncle killed his father. You remember he keeps on going up to his uncle, almost killing him. And then he backs away, and then he goes up to him again and almost kills him. And the critics, all of whom sitting in the back row there, they have to have an opinion. So they say, Hamlet is a procrastinator. Or they say, Hamlet has an Oedipus complex. No, otherwise the play would be over, stupid. That's why Shakespeare puts all that stuff in Hamlet, you know, Ophelia going mad and the play within the play and Yorick's skull and the grave diggers. That's in order to delay until Act 5 he can kill him. It's the same with the Chopin. He's just about to reach the E and he says, oops, better go back up and do it again. So he does it again. Now he gets excited. That's excitement, you don't have to worry about it. Now he gets F sharp and finally he goes down to E. But it's the wrong chord, because the chord he's looking for is this one. Instead he does. Now we call that a deceptive cadence, because it deceives us. I always tell my students, if you have a deceptive cadence, be sure to raise your eyebrows, then everybody will know. All right. So he gets 2 E, but it's the wrong chord. Now we try D again. That chord doesn't work. Now we try C again. That chord doesn't work. Now we try Z again. That doesn't work. And then finally, there was a gentleman in the front row who went, like that.
So I think you can see why I love this as an illustration of what I would love to see you do with your stories, which is to find those deceptive cadences, find the surprises and the delights and the unexpected turns. We pay attention to broken patterns. That usually has signaled food to us or threat to us. And so those kinds of interruptions of our expectation pique our attention and bring us back. So I hope that it goes without saying that we expect that all of the stories that you would tell about your work will be true, but as you tell those stories, really look for those surprising elements or ways to structure your stories that can break some of the patterns and bring some surprises in. So take a look at that story you jotted down at the top of the hour and maybe think, how does this story break expectations or bring a surprise to the audience?
So just a programming note, we've seen a couple of questions about where the hashtags of this session are. You can tweet us at hashtag StoryScience, hashtag ComNetLive, all one portmanteau of a word, ComNetLive. You can also follow the Com Network and at Frank Gathering.
Terrific. Okay. Are there any questions, other questions here that we need to address here?
Mostly about the hashtag right now.
Okay. Terrific. All right. So
actually, let's take one back. Nick has if you don't mind, if we can just go back. Nick has a good question, which is, can you talk a bit about the dangers of poorly chosen stories and how to avoid those pitfalls? So, for example, I think you're thinking about unintentionally reinforcing stereotypes or perpetuating narratives that we know to be false.
Nick, that's a great question, and we're going to ask you to be patient with us for about 6 minutes because we agree that that's a super important point, and we're actually going to talk about that shortly. So hold on.
So many of you definitely have experienced this. You're sitting on your couch, you maybe sit down at 10 a.m., and you open your favorite book or you turn on that show on Netflix you've been meaning to watch, and then the next thing you know, it's the next day. You've been transported into the world of the story that you're consuming. You lose track of time and the space around you. You're experiencing what researchers call narrative transportation. And I really like this description of narrative transportation. The traveler goes some distance from his or her world of origin, which makes some aspect of the world of origin inaccessible. The traveler returns to the world of origin somewhat changed by the journey. And what's critical here is the idea that the viewer or the reader is entering a world different from their own, that they're entering a different reality, and they spend some time there, they gain some experiences there, and they come back to their world completely changed or changed a little bit. And so this is a really critical tool that storytellers can use to tell compelling stories and tell persuasive stories. I'm going to share a couple elements of narrative transportation. There is some debate within the research as to which ones are crucial and effective, but these are the ones that I have found a couple of studies on that support narrative transportation. So first, in order to create narrative transportation, readers and viewers have to enter the emotional world of the character. In other words, we have to feel empathy for the characters in this story. We have to feel what they feel. If we feel what they feel, those experiences become our experiences. And there was this really interesting research done where researchers hooked up the brains of viewers watching Black Swan, and toward the end of the film, when Nina is losing her mind as she's competing for the role of a lifetime and performing, they found that their brains mimicked the patterns of people with schizophrenia. Just as she was hallucinating and entering and exiting reality, so were the people watching it. When we become immersed in the story, we can feel empathy with the characters, and their experiences become our experiences. Second, we have to identify with characters. And identification can come in many forms. It could be you have a shared identity. You might look like each other, have similar demographics and characteristics. You might have the same values, or you might have the same experiences. For example, there was a study that showed that people who had given organs to other people identified with characters and went through narrative transportation with characters who also had that experience, more than people who had not done that. So that doesn't necessarily mean that I'm only going to identify with women. It means that I'm going to identify with characters who've had some experience or who have some values that are similar to mine. There's also been research that suggests that when characters look like us or have experiences like us or we feel connected to them, our comprehension of the story increases. Third, you need to use mental or vivid imagery. This is critical if we want our audiences to lose a sense of awareness and enter into a different reality. So to do that, use vivid language. Talk in pictures when you're telling your stories. Think about Harry Potter. Think about Lord of the Rings. Think of Alice in Wonderland. These stories transported us to other worlds because they used such vivid language. And once you've done that, then you can create an environment or an experience for your reader or your viewer where they lose a sense of awareness of their surroundings, where they're so transported into the story that they lose a sense of where they are. Narrative transportation is useful also for trying to change people's beliefs. Research suggests that when people experience narrative transportation, it can lower psychological barriers they put up when they experience threatening information. So there was a study done where participants read an excerpt from this book, How We Die, and the excerpt was about a young woman, Kate, who was shopping at the mall on a Saturday, who was abruptly and brutally stabbed by a psychiatric patient. So they had participants read this excerpt, and they then assessed their level of narrative transportation. And they asked them questions about how they saw the world and if they thought the world was more violent today. And what they found was that for participants who had experienced narrative transportation, they reported that the world was more unjust, they were more likely to support policy around controlling psychiatric patients, and they believed violence was more frequent in the U.S., which is interesting because nowhere in that story did they talk about policy. Nowhere in that story did they share any statistics or data. It was simply a story that they were transported into that then became a reference point and experience for making decisions later on. I love the work of Melanie Green. She is a fantastic scholar working in the area of narrative transportation, and I'm going to tweet out her scholar list in a second so you can go ahead and download everything she's ever written and read it. But she says transportation effects work through reducing counter-arguing, creating connections with characters, and increasing perceptions of realism and emotional involvement. So what she's found in her research is that narrative transportation can change our beliefs because when we experience information through a story, it doesn't feel like someone's trying to persuade us or pull something over on us. We come to our own conclusion because we alone experience the story. It also changes our belief because we identify with the characters. We go through the story as the characters, imagining ourselves as them, experiencing their experiences, and then that we adopt their beliefs. And we remember those experiences in the story as if they were our own. So think about a story that you're working on. How can you incorporate the elements of narrative transportation into your story? How can you foster empathy for your characters? How can you include characters that the people you're trying to communicate with identify with? Are you using vivid images when you're telling your stories? Take a moment to think about that.
So Annie, one question that came in earlier that's actually is a really great one to think about, particularly now from Anne Sunderland, is that at this moment, when we're moving away from rational analysis and facts, how do we not contribute to the, as she calls, dangerous dumbing down of our culture, or playing into growing inability to communicate across political divide and just keep talking to our people? And I don't think that our analysis or discussion about verisimilitude was that we should just preach to our own choirs. It is just to try to fight against that initial response of when people don't necessarily engage with messages that you're sending, is that they are less intelligent or they just don't understand. We really want to use the research to demonstrate that it is much more important to find your message or ways of conveying your message that resonate with those audiences and tailoring your message that they do find it believable. So we're not saying don't communicate with them at all or just to talk to your own people, but to really take the time to research and dive into how you could craft your message and slightly tweak it for that particular audience to make that much more engaging for them. And there are a lot of really great questions that are coming in that we've got one more imperative, and then we'll get to Q&A.
Okay. So someone had the question that how do you tell stories that don't reinforce stereotypes? And that's where we encourage you to think about master and counter narratives. A master narrative is a common narrative told about a particular issue. Often it becomes a single story or a stereotypical story about an experience or an issue or a group of people. These are the stories that we hear over and over again when we look to a particular issue. A counter-narrative is a narrative that doesn't conform to that. Counter-narratives are different from the common stories that we hear over and over again, and often they're created by social movements and activists who are trying to push out a different understanding than the dominant one about their issue or the people that they care about. So when you think about refugees, for example, if you look at the data, if you look at the academic research on how refugees are represented in the media, the news media particularly, you find that over and over again they're either presented as a burden or a threat. And so that is a master narrative about refugees. To counter that, people working in the humanitarian sector have been trying to tell a different type of story about refugees. The strategy is to show that refugees are just like us, you could be a refugee, and look at how they've moved from riches to rags or rags to riches. But what we're seeing as we look at these refugee stories is that that same story is being told over and over and over again. And people are starting to get narrative fatigue. They expect to hear a story about a refugee who had to flee and who is now just lost from her family. Those are important stories to tell, but if we tell the same stories over and over again, we create a new master narrative that doesn't leave space for complexity and diversity. So instead, we encourage you to think about how you could tell counter narratives to master narratives that really challenge the single stories that people have in their mind or the dominant stories people have in their mind about issues. How can you use those plots to the 7 basic plots to tell a different type of story? Here's a really great example of a refugee story that I think is a great counter narrative. This is a video that Fusion created, and I'm going to tweet out the link. And it's the story of a Syrian ballet dancer who loved to dance back from his home, but was forced to leave. And he ends up in, I believe, Sweden, and joins a dance company. And there he is able to break away from the constraints of where he came from and truly dance. And it's such a beautiful story, but what it really is a rebirth story. So rather than being this master narrative around how to help refugees, that's a rags to riches, riches to rags, let's help them assimilate. This is a story of self-empowerment and rebirth. And I'll tweet that link out.
He has not come in for me to.
Okay, so think about the stories that you tell around your issues. Are you playing into a master narrative? Are you telling the same stories that other people are telling about your issue? And what can a counter narrative be? How can you use the 7 basic plots to play with a different narrative, or use emotion to play with a different feeling that someone might feel about your issue? And how can you work in contextual elements to tell inclusive stories about your work?
So as you're thinking about that, we're, at this point, in our last couple minutes, happy to answer any questions that you have, and there are a couple that have come in, so please continue to send those through. But in classic style, but wait, there's more, we're really actually looking at 9 principles, not just the 7. We are also looking at 2 other areas in how we choose stories around what resonates and how things resonate with individuals and groups and affinity groupings, as well as how you have to, as communicators, tap into people's habits and go to the people and not expect the people to come to you. So we're fascinated by all this area. We are continuing to do sessions like this, talking to individuals and groups. We're also putting together, among everything else that we're doing, a kind of recap of the 9 principles on and we'll publish that on the site scienceofstories.org. You can go there now, sign up for an email when we finalize the report and send it out. There's also information from our college about some of the research around stories and storytelling that we've done. And we also encourage you to check out frank.jou.ufl.edu. That site, you can sign up for Frankology, which is a periodic email that dives into some of the areas and more developing areas of research around science of storytelling, as well as the other resources that we have here in our study of public interest communications. And Annie and I are here to help in any way, and we'll certainly be welcoming you all to reach out to us. And our contact information is there. And now we've got, I think, a couple questions in our time remaining. Sean, it looks like we've got about 2 minutes in our organized time.
Yeah, if you guys have a little bit more time, we'll ask the indulgence. We have quite a number of folks here, as you know, so let's just see where we can get.
Great. So there was one question that, Annie, maybe you could answer Lori's question around mastering counter narratives. Is one of the big challenges if your work helps people who are really, really struggling, folks with mental illness, chronologically homeless, etc., audiences don't want to identify with them. They want to keep them in the other category. And Andy Goodman wrote in with a really great point that good storytellers introduce you to a person whom you can meet, like, and root before you can give away any kind of label, whether they're homeless, victims, refugees, etc. So correct me if I'm wrong, Annie, but are looking at kind of the use of counter narratives helps fight against some of that pushing to the other, right?
Right, and I think that a lot of counter narrative doesn't necessarily mean you use completely different characters than the ones that you have to talk about. They're the ones that you're working for. But it means that you highlight other elements of their life that are unexpected, that are a deceptive cadence, that could maybe connect someone to their experience or surprising. I just lost my thought.
I think it's when it comes to this issue of stereotypes and overcoming them, I think it's important to be really mindful of what the dominant story is, and to be really mindful about not telling that story over and over again in new ways. And I think that that's a really important thing for all of us to remember, because it is certainly true that many of our stories follow, as we tell stories about the issues that matter to us most, that most of those stories do follow predictable arcs. And so sometimes looking at those story structures and looking at how you can reimagine your story using a different plot structure could be a really powerful way to overcome that.
So Alex had another question about the 7 basic plots and whether more than one can be used for a story. And I think our collective response would be yes, absolutely. And we've seen multiple stories that do take elements from each of those 7 plots or multiples of those 7 plots or reframe those 7 plots. Anne mentioned earlier about the riches to rags story. It is a descendant of the rags to riches basic plot. Excuse me. Annie, this is a question we sometimes get. Can you share an example of small or large-scale nonprofit organizations that are telling great stories?
Yes, well, I think that the Maria Shriver group did a great job with Paycheck to Paycheck. If you look at the work of UNHCR's Innovation Service, they're doing really interesting work around telling the story of the experience of refugees, but they're doing work where they're telling the stories of the humanitarian aid worker and what it's like to be a humanitarian aid worker, which is a really interesting approach when you're trying to raise money or change sentiment around the experiences of refugees to focus on the aid worker. It takes a little bit of cognitive gymnastics to enter the world of a refugee, and if it ignites all of these these feelings where we feel bad or we feel guilty, we may not even engage with those stories. But if we could feel pride in the humanitarian workers who are doing that work, then it might open us up to hearing those stories.
Yeah, I think perspective taking can be a really powerful tool in storytelling, and thinking about whether there's a character in your story whose plotline you can amplify as a way of bringing that other dimension into the story, and creating and building out a character who people aren't going to be afraid to empathize with.
Lori had a question about people having limited attention spans and how we can tell a compelling story in a post or a tweet. And I think that is a very interesting and not easy question to answer. I would posit, and I'd love to hear Anne and Annie's perspective on this, is that while social media tweets and posts are a tool, they may not necessarily be the best tactic to conveying your information. Nick Bilton wrote a very interesting piece, I believe it was in Vanity Fair this week, about how we may, some of us hopefully, be approaching the post-social age in communication. So I think we need to start to take that into account as we're telling it. So yes, telling a complete beginning, middle, and end story in 280 characters is difficult. It's not impossible.
I would say, though, that one post doesn't have to be the beginning, middle, and end. I just read this great story in the New York Times about this hippo at the Ohio Zoo who is a viral success, and people would tune in every day to see what's new with this hippo. And when the zoo didn't post about the hippo, they would write to them and say, "Excuse me, I need my hippo fix for the day." That's an ongoing story told on social media that is really interesting to me. And I've also seen that done really well in sort of the Instagram fitness world, where women are using Instagram stories to tell their own stories of health transformation. And you check in every morning to see what are their struggles, what are they overcoming, and you build a connection to them. So I would say don't think about social media as just the post you send out at 2 o'clock, but think of it as a tool to tell compelling stories in interesting ways.
I also would go to some of the science around curiosity in thinking that through, and really recognizing that people are most curious about the things that they know most about, not the things that they know least about. So I love the example of the hippos. Was that the hippo who was on Tinder?
I think so. They call her a diva. That's all. I can't remember her name.
But using those kinds of tools to open up people's understanding and knowledge so that they can become more curious and really want more, and the science of curiosity really supports that.
So we're about 5 minutes over time, and we want to be respectful of your time, and we thank you for joining us today. Sean, any other questions that we can, or any other things you'd like us to take care of?
No, I think maybe just an offer to everybody. We really first of all, thank you to all three of you, to Matt, to Annie, and to Anne. I'm sure you all got a sense of just how extraordinary these folks are, and I think we're all grateful for all the knowledge and information you've just shared. There's a lot to take in. And I'd posit a challenge to the folks who are still with us on the line. Annie had a couple of really great examples of organizations that are using storytelling really well, but this is actually a great opportunity for us to sort of crowdsource this. So if you're online and you have a chance, you could use the science or story science or the ComNet Live hashtag, or ideally both. Send us an example of a great nonprofit or foundation that's using storytelling really, really well. I think it'll be helpful. We'll try to collect them, and maybe we can use that as a piece that we post up when we share the webinar, when we post it up online, the recording up online shortly. In the meantime, last thing I wanted to say to you guys is this is quite prescient that we're doing this conversation about storytelling, because our next issue of our Change Agent Journal, you only get this if you're a network member, but our Change Agent Journal is coming out, and the theme for this issue is, wait for it, storytelling. And we're actually going to be hearing from Anne and Annie, wrote a fantastic piece for us. We're also going to hear from the irreplaceable Andy Goodman. The Moth makes a contribution, if you know them, the storytelling platform. The Brookings Institution, as well as World Wildlife Fund and the Rockefeller Foundation, and a lot of other really smart folks. So in the span of about 80 pages, you're going to get super smart with a lot of perspectives from really extraordinary organizations that are thinking about storytelling. And if you want my own example of great nonprofit storytelling, we just put this out in the network's newsletter. World Wildlife Fund did something really cool. Not only did they tell a compelling story, but they did it in a really innovative way. They made an interactive comic book to tell the story of a tiger whose name I cannot pronounce, but starts with an O. And you can check it out if you have the network's newsletter handy. Take a look for that. You can click on the link and get there. To everybody, thank you so much. Please do take the survey that pops up in just a moment, and we will be sharing both the slides as well as the replay of this webinar in the next few days. So thanks very much, and thanks again to the full team at the University of Florida. You guys are amazing, and we remain in your debt and in your awe. Thanks so much.